All right. And as people start to arrive, we'll go ahead and share in the chat while we're waiting to get started. We have about 5 minutes before we officially begin. So if you're joining us early, thank you. I love all of this promptness with everybody showing up on time. While you arrive, if you could take a moment to say hello in the chat and let us know, what was the name of one of your favorite stories growing up? So today we're talking about meetings and stories, and we're going to start by focusing on stories. Paul, what was one of your favorite stories growing up?
Well, you're probably going to hear a whole lot of my stories in the next 30 or 40 minutes. I'm not sure if you want to spoil some of those.
I'm guessing that your childhood stories and your business stories are not the same.
Sometimes they are. Sometimes your personal stories play a very pivotal role. So in fact, I'll tell you one of my dad's stories that he told me, but he didn't tell me as a child. He told me as an adult, and it made a very big difference in my life. So it was about the time that I was trying to decide to leave my corporate career and take this job. I can't even call this a job, can I? To become an author and a speaker. And I was in my mid 40s, so a difficult decision to make, to walk away from a corporate career, too young to retire. And so I asked my dad for advice, and I thought he would just tell me, you should do it. Definitely. I've got faith in you. Go pursue your dream, or tell me I'm crazy, right? Like keep your head down, retire comfortably and then go play around with these silly ideas. And he didn't. All he did was tell me a story about himself as a kid. He said, when I was 5 years old, I knew exactly what I wanted to do in life. He said, I wanted to be a singer like Frank Sinatra or Tony Bennett, Sammy Davis Jr. And he's 80, right? Or was at the time. And he said, I knew that the first day of the first grade, the teacher asked if any of us had any special talent. Well, I raised my hand and I said, I can sing. Now, despite the fact that he'd never sung in front of anybody but his mom in the kitchen. So, of course, what would a good teacher do if a 5-year-old said that in her class?
She would invite him to sing.
Of course. So,
right.
Well, Bobby, sing us a song. So 5-year-old Bobby Smith stands up and belts out his favorite tune, and he says, I nailed it. I got all the melody and all the words right. And he said the students and the teacher stood up and they applauded me. Like I got a standing ovation my first time. And, he said, that's when I knew this is what I was destined to do in my life. But he said, unfortunately, that turned out not just to be the first time I ever sang in front of an audience. It turned out to be the last time I ever sang in front of an audience. And he said, the truth is, I just never had the courage to go through with it. And he literally, he said at the end of this email that he's writing me, he said, I'd love to see you pursue your dream, but that doesn't mean in your lifetime, son. That means in mine. Right. Nice. So, oh my gosh, TikTok, right? Right. I mean, the guy was 80. Right. So literally 2 days later, I walk in and I resigned from my 20-year career to pursue that dream. And it was that story that my dad told me that made the difference. So that's an example of a very personal story that my family now treasures, but yet it became a work story because it affected my career. So they definitely blend.
Oh, that's a great story from the past. And I can see in the chat now, if you're just arriving and just joining us, we'll get started officially in another minute or so. But while you're arriving, if you want to take a moment to say hi, you can chat to, there's a little blue button. If you make it everyone, that's really awesome because then everybody can see what you're saying. And I can see that Tony Cox, as she was growing, or their favorite story was Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And I know for me, as a child, one of my favorite stories was Robin Hood. And I think that has absolutely impacted the way that we approach our business. We don't play the same game that the Wall Street folks play, right? We definitely have a different approach, which is why we do so many free webinars and write so much free educational material. Those stories that we embrace as kids absolutely impact who we come to believe we are. So anyone else have a favorite story that they remember from their childhood that they'd like to share in the chat? Well, and as you all, hi, Ewa. As you all join, go ahead and say hi. Welcome to our webinar today. We are right at the top of the hour, and today we are talking about the right story for every meeting. So we're pairing story with meeting. And, you know, just to get things clear right up front, you don't have to worry if you want to enjoy or talk or be part of this conversation. So it is a webinar. We will be talking to you, but we want to talk with you. So the chat is open. Paul and I both can see that, and we will definitely love to hear your ideas and your thoughts as we go through this. Yes, there will be a recording, and we will send that out afterwards. And yes, we'll take some time for questions, probably throughout. So if you've got questions, I'm the CEO and founder of Lucid Meetings. I'm the author of the book, Where the Action Is. And at Lucid Meetings, it's our mission to make it easy for teams to run successful meetings every day. Easy, right? To make it easy. Well, that's a little bit of a challenge because meetings, when you look at them, are actually really complex. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of different people involved. There's a lot of different work involved. There's personalities and deadlines and stress and pressure. And making all of that easy is an incredible challenge. So one of our jobs is to at least make it easier. And one of the things that we have discovered over the years is that one of the easiest ways to get everybody engaged with what you're talking about, to help them really see what you're trying to accomplish, to change what they believe, and therefore then what they do, is through the power of story. Which is why today I am thrilled to introduce you all to Paul Smith. Paul Smith and I met, we were both on the same podcast. We were on the Brainfluence podcast, and we connected afterwards because we found that while at Lucid, we have looked at the different kinds of meetings that we use in business, Paul is an expert in the different kinds of stories that we use to make businesses run successfully. He's the author of 5 books and is here to share some of those stories with us today. Paul, do you want to say hi? Introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for the introduction there. Yeah, I just, the only thing I'd add to that is I spent most of my career doing normal type jobs. So jobs much like the people that are probably watching here today. I haven't always been an author and a storyteller. I spent 20 years in the corporate world doing the same kind of corporate things you do. So I've been through every one of these types of meetings that we're about to go through, and I've seen them go really well, and I've seen them go really poorly. And so, yeah, I hope to add some very practical value to your discussion about those meetings today.
That is so awesome. We're talking about meetings and storytelling, and this is going to be crazy practical. So speaking of crazy practical, let's go ahead and get into the details right off the bat. So here at Lucid, when we talk about different kinds of meetings, we're looking at 16 distinct types of meetings. So this taxonomy, where teams come together for a specific purpose. So at the top, we have meetings where we're bringing our teams together to make sure that we all still like each other and that the work is moving ahead and we're on track. We have meetings where we come together to make decisions, to solve problems, to come up with great big ideas about our future. And then we have a whole bunch of meetings we run where we're trying to figure things out, you know, meet new people, make great impressions, get buy-in and enthusiasm for what we're doing. And of these, there are 5 that we thought were critically important for leaders to be prepared, to have stories prepared to make those meetings truly successful. So the 5 meetings we're going to be focusing on today are, first, introductions. And we'll talk each one as we go through a little bit about what that meeting is, and then Paul will share a story about how you can use stories in that meeting. So first, introduction. So those first meetings where you're first getting to know people. So new hires, new sales, looking for a mentor, all of those kinds of things. Next, team cadence meetings. So these are the bulk of the meetings in our organization, those weekly meetings. Then broadcasts. So as leaders, we all have times where we need to stand up in front of a large group and talk about our company. What kind of stories should you bring to those? Governance cadence meetings. These are meetings that we use. These are our board meetings. These are our quarterly check-ins with our clients. These are places where we're dealing with people who are kind of in our circle, but they're also kind of external to our day-to-day work. And we really need to make sure that that relationship is leaving them with a great impression. And then finally, and I think one of the more intriguing places to apply storytelling is in the problem-solving meeting. You got a team, there's trouble. How do you use stories to get you out of it? So with that, those are our 5 types. Again, at any point, if you have questions, pop them in the chat and let's get started. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because we're going to tell stories. We don't need to look at slides. So let's start with introductions. Now, as I mentioned, the whole key to success with an introduction meeting, and this is, again, those new hire first interviews, or you're doing your pitch for your business to the banker or an investor or whatnot, the key to success with an interview or an introduction is that the person you're talking to decides at the end that they want to talk to you again. Like, this is the universe of first impressions and an awesome, powerful, making people feel like the time they spend with you is worthwhile. So Paul, given an introduction, what kind of stories do leaders and their teams really need to have in the bag to do that well?
Yeah, so there are a couple of types that you'll want to tell during an introduction. One is about you personally, and one is about the company you represent. And the reason it's important to tell a personal story is that what you want to do is build trust very quickly in one of those early meetings. In fact, there was a New York Times study done a couple of decades ago that really shed some light on this. They asked the question, what % of people in the world are trustworthy? And the answer, surprisingly, was like 30%. I mean, it was really sad, right? The average person thinks that only about 1/3 of people are trustworthy. But then they asked the question a different way. They said, what % of the people that you know personally are trustworthy? And the answer shot up to like 80 or 90%. And the reason, of course, is that people naturally default to not trusting people that they don't know, and naturally trusting people that they do know until you give them a reason not to, right? So just moving from somebody that is unknown to known immediately moves you into the circle of trust until you earn your way out of it, right? You don't want to earn your way out of it. But you can't do that by just reading your resume to somebody. But telling them a personal story will let them feel like they know you personally. So a personal story is kind of the shortest distance between being a stranger and a friend. So for example, the story that I told you right before we went on air here is a personal story about me and my dad, right? After hearing that, you know me a little bit personally now, not just my resume and the name of my books. So that probably earns a little bit of trust. So you want to tell some kind of a personal story, even if it's just a little short one, to move yourself into that personal circle of trust. The second type of story you want to tell is about your company. And that's because people want to know that your company is not just this, big amorphous corporate entity. You want them to know that it's full of human beings, real people that they can do business with. And the best story to tell is usually the founding story, like the founding of the company. And the reason is because like nobody ever quit their job, risked everything to go start a new company for a boring reason, right? There's always an exciting reason behind it. And that exciting reason makes for an exciting story. So it will show the people you're talking to, not only who you are, who your company is, but shows them that passion for doing whatever it is that your company does. So for example, back in the late 1980s, there's a guy named Gary Erickson who was a cyclist, and he would go out on these 100, 200-mile bicycle rides. Well, he was out on one of these long treks one day with a buddy of his, and they were 150 miles into a 170 or a 200-mile ride. So it's 50 miles left. And they brought, the stuff you have to bring on those trips, which is basically a bunch of energy bars, right? Because they burn a lot of calories on it.
Yeah.
No, this was back in 1980, right?
So before goo even.
Before all that. So if you remember back to the 1980s, if you're old enough to remember that, the only energy bar that there was just this really sticky, hard, chewy thing, right? And there was only one brand on the market, and everybody had to eat it. And so he had 6 of them in his pockets, and he'd already eaten 5 of them, but he still had 50 miles left to go. They're at the top of a hill. They're taking a break. He pulls out the 6th bar and he just says, I can't do it. I cannot eat another one of these things. I mean, they're just horrible, right? They're hard as a rock. They're sticky. They pull your, if you got cavities, they make them worse. And if you got fillings, they pull them out and they sit in your stomach like a rock. It's just, he said, it's awful. Like, why do we have to suffer through this? And part of the reason why that was probably on his mind is because his day job, he was a baker. He ran a bakery, right? And that's when it occurred to me, he's like, I could make a better energy bar than this. In fact, I'm going to make a better energy bar than this. And so he didn't eat it. He and his buddy finished their ride, and all the way down, he's thinking about how to do it. And he gets home and he goes and visits his mom, and his mom is the one that helped him start his first bakery. And they start working on a formula. And like 6 months later, they came up with what he thought was the perfect energy bar. It wasn't hard, wasn't sticky, didn't have any processed, foods. It didn't have any added sugar. It was all natural, but so everything that you'd want in a good energy bar. And he'd already named his bakery after his mom. So when this energy bar came out, he decided to name it after his dad. His dad's name is Clifford. And that's how the Cliff Bar was born. Right. So that story tells you about how the Cliff Bar company was founded. Right.
Yeah.
I could tell you that, the date and the ages and the names, but the story gives you the reason why he started the company.
Yeah. So much better than all of those PowerPoints about, we were started here and now we've grown to this and we moved our headquarters then and we were funded and here's our Series A and all of those things.
Right. Yeah.
And a story like that. So if we're going to turn this into a takeaway for those of you who are with us, and at any point, if you've got questions, definitely hop in and chat with us. If you are a leader in an organization, writing your founding story and then sharing your founding story. So it's something that I know I get to do quite a bit when I do podcasts and whatnot, but sharing it in a way that it's available to everybody on your team so that when your folks are out there, and I don't mean just the sales folks, but everybody. So every one of your developers and frontline people who go home and they're telling their families and they're telling their communities about the company that they work for. How can you put that story out there in a way that they can then share that increases their reputation? How can that be a story that they're proud of and that then makes everybody else interested to want to be a part of that, to want to see them again, to find them interesting and exciting?
Exactly.
Would you have another takeaway for that one on the introduction specifically?
No, I think those are the two most important, a personal story and your company founding story. And those are probably good enough to get you started.
Awesome. So let's move on to the second type. So we just talked about introduction. So the next one we're going to talk about is the team cadence meeting. And we did this on purpose because it's a little bit of whiplash, right? So you've got introductions where you're saying, hey, I'm making this amazing first impression and I'm telling the story about how wonderful Cliff Bars are. And then when you go back and you're in the Cliff Bar factory and you're having the 45th status meeting of the week, these sort of regular update team meetings, how can you use storytelling to make those more interesting?
Yeah. So I think here what I wanted to do was to share a story about one of those team cadence meetings and something that went horribly wrong so that you can learn from that experience and change the way you do your cadence meetings. So this particular story happened at a company called Excel Models and Talent. So it's a modeling and talent agency run by Melissa Moody. And so it was a small business. She probably had 10 or 15 employees, and 3 of those employees were her children, her adult children. Okay. Mm-hmm. So she was having her staff meeting, her team cadence meeting that she has once a week with all the employees. And in the middle of the meeting, her youngest daughter, who was probably 23 or 24 years old at the time, named Brooke Moody, she noticed that Brooke started sinking down lower into her chair, lower and lower and lower and lower. And like the mom in her immediately kicked in and she's like, my child is misbehaving. She's just looking for attention. I'm going to ignore her and she'll sit up and stop goofing off, but it didn't work because Brooke just kept getting lower and lower and lower. And she literally ended up like disappearing completely behind the desk in, Melissa's desk.
When we have that happen, it's because somebody hit the raise on their automatic desk.
Right. So, but this is back before we had these fancy. No, yeah. It was not. It was intentional on Brooke's part. Right. And so, Melissa continues to ignore her, thinking she'll straighten up any minute. And then she notices out of the corner of her eye the shadow of something near the door, and she looks, and it's her daughter crawling on her hands and knees, slowly outside the door of the office and down the hallway. Okay, so clearly Brooke was bored out of her mind, right? That's what was going on at that moment. She was just bored to tears and could not wait to get out of there, because normally in these not normally, sometimes in these team cadence meetings, the boss is talking about something that's important to him or her, and one other person in the room, and then another person, and then another topic that's interesting. The boss is interested in all of them, but all the people in the room maybe only work on some of those projects, and it just totally has nothing to do with them. Well, that was the case with Brooke. And because she was the boss's daughter, she knew she could get away with it. So she just slunk down her chair and crawled out. And at the end of that meeting, Melissa realized, gosh, if my daughter's that bored in these meetings, probably there are other people that are bored, but none of them are brave enough to crawl out of the meeting because they know I'd fire them on the spot, right? But Brooke knows that I won't. And that's when she realized, I've got to change something, right? So she immediately changed her team meetings to where it was only a few topics that she knew would be relevant to everybody. So her meetings went from like 2 hours to 1 hour. And all those individual topics, she moved to the individual one-on-one meetings with the appropriate people. So now all the meetings don't waste anybody's time. Does that fit in? Is that in keeping with the advice that you give people about these team cadence meetings?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great way to illustrate one of the core findings from the scientific research into meetings, which is that there is always one person in the room who tends to find the weekly meeting to be effective. And it's, who would you guess?
The boss. It's the boss.
Yeah, exactly right. It's whoever's in charge, right? And if we look at the dynamics of effective meetings, it's because they know absolutely what to expect and they get to participate the whole time. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the underlying causes to chronically terrible meetings that we see across corporations today. It's just the people in charge think they're doing just fine, thank you. So I think that story is a really wonderfully vivid way to visualize why, in fact, having folks there who are not participating is disrespectful and wasteful. It's a waste of their time, and frankly, as a business leader, it's a huge waste of your money, right? Because you're paying these people to be bored and doodle.
Yeah, exactly. or crawl out of the meeting, as the case may be.
So what we find with team cadence meetings is that getting everybody involved in things that are generative, right? So rather than information sharing, what we want to be doing is information creation, right? How are we creating more understanding, more alignment, more engagement, stronger beliefs in our teams? And I think when we talked before, we had a suggestion of how you could use team cadence meetings to do that.
Yeah. So one of the things you'll need as a leader are lots of stories to share to communicate the leadership messages that you want and your company values and your vision and all kinds of things. And it's hard to collect all those stories. Well, one way you can use your team cadence meetings is to collect a new story each time. So if you meet once a week, every week you would have someone assigned to bring in a story and share. And it should just be 2 or 3 minutes, like the short stories that I've been sharing here. They're just short little 2 or 3 minute stories that don't take a lot of your meeting time. But every week, like this week is my week and next week is your week and next week is Sally's week and then Bob and then Jim and whatever. So after a year, you've got 52 stories added to your mental repertoire of stories that you can tell. And people have plenty of time in advance to, come up with one, listen for one, go find one, et cetera. So it's not very burdensome, but it's a way to make your meetings intentionally useful as a story collection device.
And then as everybody hears those stories, they get to understand a little bit better what your company's about or things that serve your mission. So in our case, when we collect stories of a couple of different kinds in our team cadence meetings. And I saw a question come in about, what kind of stories should you collect? For our work, we focus on meeting performance. So the kinds of stories we collect are stories about things we've learned or experienced with our customers, right? We met a customer recently that was hoping that we could help them with their meeting performance, but they were having this problem where every one of the leaders was triple booked. So they were looking for a meeting strategy that said, how can we run an effective meeting where people can come in and out randomly for just 10 minutes of any conversation? Not a really exciting story, but an interesting insight for my team to have about some of the things that people are dealing with and some of the beliefs they have about what should be possible in meetings. Because the answer is you can't. You can't design a meeting where people will randomly show up. So that having that conversation and understanding that culture was important for my team to help understand how do we work with a client like that. The other kinds of stories that we collect are stories that help illustrate important ideas for our mission. So we tell a lot of stories about how the Navy SEALs learn to meet under pressure and quickly change their plans. Or, how people at Pixar meet to review their designs so that they make amazing movies, right? So stories about what we do in practice out in the world to help give us context. Do you have other recommendations?
Well, yes, but I think we're talking about broadcast meetings next. And I think in that I was going to share 10 different types of meetings. So that will answer the question.
Perfect. Why don't we do that? So the next type of meeting we are in fact talking about is the broadcast. And the broadcast meeting, basically the nature of a broadcast meeting is one or more people is up here talking at a whole bunch of other people. And ideally there's some way for all the other people to interact somehow, questions or polls or small groups or something. But in reality, most of the time it's talking heads. So it's a push communication. And the reason we do push communication meetings is to tell an important story that we want to have then inspire other people to take action. So you might have a meeting with your analysts or with the press, and that as a business leader is meant to get you noticed in the newspapers and have everybody believe your company's great so your stock price goes up. Or you might have an all hands or an all staff meeting with your company. And that meeting is designed to help everybody in your company understand, what's going on contextually, but also to understand that they are part of something bigger than what is happening in their little day-to-day task list, right? They are part of a larger community, a larger organization, and something that matters in the world. And then there are broadcasts like this one where we're sharing information and, our goal is both to get a chance to tell our stories, but also to inspire people to want to work with us because we're awesome to work with. So Paul, what are 10 of the key kinds of stories leaders might want to tell and bring to those broadcasts?
Yeah, so the first four kind of go together because they're about setting direction for the organization, which oftentimes these broadcast meetings are about. It's to set direction. So those first four are, first of all, where we came from. So that's that founding story that we just talked about, like the Cliff Bar story. Why we can't stay there. So that's a case for change story. Where we're going, which is a vision story, and how we're going to get there, which is a strategy story, right? Strategies about how you're going to get from where you are now to where you want to be. So if you can tell those four stories, you've got a much better chance of getting the organization to go where you want them to go, right? So where we came from, why we can't stay there, where we're going, and how we're going to get there, right? So those are the first four. The next four.
Question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can I ask a question? So on those, please. Do you, I'm familiar with vision stories, right? Because vivid visioning and writing the story that says, in 10 years, I'm going to walk into the room and they're going to be 45 people all experimenting with sticky notes because we've built the Meeting Innovation Center, right? Mm-hmm. So you tell a story that helps people understand what it looks like and feels like and smells like when you've achieved your vision. I get that
exactly.
one. Would you tell where we're coming from and why we can't stay there and the vision and how we're going to go all at the same time? Or are those different kinds of occasions?
Yeah, not necessarily. They're probably different occasions. So like when you're about to roll out your new company vision, you probably want to tell the vision story. Yeah. But there's probably no reason at that moment to tell the founding story. You've probably told that to the same group before, right? Some of them beg to go together. Like if you're going to roll out a new vision and you haven't even talked about the new vision at all yet, you probably want to start with the second story, the case for change. Why can we not be satisfied with the old vision? Mm-hmm. That's the case for change. So that leads right into the new vision. Now, at some point in the near future, you probably want to tell the strategy story because people pretty quickly, once they get their minds around the vision, the next question is going to be, okay, well, how are we going to do it? Well, that's when the strategy story comes into play. But it's probably not that all 4 of those stories would be told in the same 1-hour meeting. They probably should be staged apart appropriately.
Sure. Cool. Okay. All right. So that's the first 4.
First 4. Yeah. So next 4 kind of go together as well, but they're more about who we are as an organization. So that's what we believe. So that's a corporate values story. Who we serve. So that's a customer story, a story about your customer so that everybody can have a personal, visceral understanding of who we're working for. 7 is what we do for our customers. So that's kind of a classical sales story, right? Like I think everybody needs to be able to tell a sales story, even if you're not in sales, right? At least one, right? To know.
So yeah. So in that case, are you looking to like tell a case study story kind of a thing? Like, let me tell you about, this organization I just worked with.
Right. And here was their problem and here's what we did for them and here's how it turned out. Right. Exactly. Right. A customer success story. And then 8 is how we're different from our competitors. So that's, I call that a marketing story because marketing is typically about how you differentiate yourself from your competitors. But again, it's a real story about, how you do something and how your competitors do it. And you can clearly see the difference between them. Right. So imagine you can tell those 4 stories, you can easily basically say, as a company, who we are, who we serve, what we do for them, and how we're different from our competitors. And again, those might not all be told at the same time. In fact, they probably wouldn't be. You tell them when you need that story to be told, right? Mm-hmm. Right. And then, go ahead.
I know I'm making you go deeper on these, but
that's all right. Good.
So the one I think that we struggle with at Lucid the most is the who we serve story, right? Mm-hmm. Because we find like we serve people who have meetings. So, that's not much of a targeted market. That's the entirety of the universe. But within that, our goal is to serve people who believe in people. Right. And I don't know how to tell that story. How do you tell the story of who you serve? Can you give us an example?
Yeah. So let me not use me as an example. The best way to tell a story like this is to go out and meet your customers face to face and interview them, ask them questions, find out what their problems are, how your product or service fits into that, how satisfied are they with it. For some of us, that's easy. For you and me, we meet, our customers face to face anytime we work with them. But if you make a product that gets sold at a grocery store, you may never run into somebody who uses your product because they go to Kroger and buy it or Walmart or whatever, right? Mm-hmm. Go meet them, go find a way, hook up with your research department and go make a situation where you can meet them face to face. So for example, the example I give in the book is about a brand of feminine protection products, feminine hygiene products, and they're being sold in India. So they're doing research in India, and this is back in the 1980s. And it's in a rural area of India. So it's a very traditional family structure where the husband is out working, the wife is at home. There's one daughter, and the wife buys this really expensive brand of feminine protection product for her daughter, her teenage daughter, but not for herself. And so they're interviewing her and trying to figure out why do you buy the expensive one for your daughter, but not yourself? And she starts to explain how, well, it's really important that she does well in school. And, if she ends up, having staining or, on her dress or something, it's very embarrassing. And then she can't focus on her studies and listen to the teacher if she's always worried about, spotting or something. So I want her to have the expensive brand so that nothing like that happens. And the interviewer says, well, why is it that important for her to do so well in school? Like pretty much everybody in this community, you end up creating these arranged marriages and getting your daughters married off early and to stay in this very traditional family structure that they have in the culture there. And the woman looks really, intently, leans forward and says, because I don't want my daughter to be like me. Right? It's important to me that she gets her own education, be able to be financially independent. I don't want her married off at the age of 18 like me. And all of a sudden it became very clear why it was very important to her to buy the expensive brand for her daughter. And that moment, that interview, that became the story that they would tell around the office. Is now I know you're the customer and I understand her needs and her wants and why it's worth spending all this money on this product. But without that story, it's just, there's almost no way to explain the importance of that product to that customer.
And without that story, I can see internally how challenging it would be to motivate yourself to continue to work on those products day after day.
Exactly. Right? And that's why they tell that story to the other people that work at the company. So they are motivated to do well with that product and understand their customer in a more personal, human way.
One of the facilitators that we work with talks a lot about, there's all of this talk out there right now about connecting to purpose and meaning and, all of that. And the implication seems to be that you have to work for a company that has this huge higher purpose, right? But the power of stories and the finding those stories and sharing those stories tells us that it doesn't have to be that you're saving the planet. To be doing things that you can take pride in and that you can feel connection to and that you can be part of, really making excellent. So I love that. I love that example. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. So I think we have 2 more, right?
Yeah, 2 more, right? Mm-hmm.
All right. So the last 2 kind of go together as well, but they're more about you, the leader. Okay. So number 9 is why I lead the way I do. So that's a personal leadership philosophy story. And number 10 is why you should want to work here. So that's a recruiting story. And by the way, you the person you're talking to, not you, right? So, so whoever you're talking, you want to tell them a story to help them realize how awesome it is to work here, because every leader's job is to bring in talented people to the organization and have them want to stay, right? So those 2 stories help you do that. They help you bring in talented people and they help them understand your leadership style so that they will appreciate it and quite frankly, follow your leadership.
Excellent. So I can see how some of the things we talked about with introductions feed in here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that why I lead the way I do story, especially that's a good introductory story, especially to a new hire or a new person on your team so that they can understand why you are the leader, the kind of leader you are.
Right. And then I can see how, who we serve and how we serve them kinds of stories help with the why you should want to work here. If,
that too.
Unless your story is like, hey, we got football,
right.
and the kegerator, in which case, okay.
The sign of a good story is that you can use it for multiple purposes. So exactly.
Right. Right. So in terms of, there's a question in the chat, which is, is there an example of a leadership style story? So like how I lead.
Yeah. So my favorite example of that comes from a guy named Mike Figliolo, who was he went to West Point. So he was in the Army. So his first leadership experience was in the Army, leading a platoon of tanks, right? And his first leadership opportunity was actually in a training exercise. It wasn't even in real battle, but a training exercise it's probably 25 years ago out in Camp Pendleton, California, I believe. And so imagine a 5-mile wide by 10-mile long stretch of training field. And there are 800 tanks, real tanks that are going to go into simulated battle, right? But they're not shooting live ordnances at each other because they obviously don't want to hurt each other.
That would be bad. Yeah.
That would be bad, right? So they're just, it's like they're using lasers, right? So it's like, think of a giant game of laser tag, but with real tanks, right?
I will never have a leadership story that cool. Laser tanks.
Neither. Awesome. The laser tag with tanks. That is awesome, right? So imagine 400 tanks on one side of the field and 400 on the other side of the field are going to go into battle. And Mike gets assigned, for whatever reason, to be in charge of the first tank that's on his side of the field that's going to go into battle in a wedge formation with 399 tanks behind him. So his job's really important. So he sits down with the commanding officer the night before and they look at a map of the terrain and they figure out a good battles plan, how to get to the high ground and, win the exercise. So the next morning it starts and they're racing out onto the field, and 3 or 4 minutes into it, he gets to a place where he's got to figure out which way to turn and he just doesn't know what to do. Apparently, a battlefield being looked at through the crack in a hatch of a tank that's bouncing around at 40 miles an hour looks differently than it does on a map in a conference room, right? So he's just stymied. He doesn't know what to do. So he's got a choice to make. He can either stop the tank, turn the light on, get the map out, and figure out the right thing to do, which might take, 30 seconds, or he can just guess. Well, Mike chose option 2. He just yells out, "Driver, turn left," right? Even though he has no idea if that's the right thing to do. So driver turns left. Well, a minute or so later, the little light in his tank goes on, which means you just got shot by a laser, you're dead. Okay, so they have to stop the tank, pop the hatch, get out, they're done for the day. Well, a few seconds later, of course, the next tank that turned right behind them, their light goes on, they're dead. Next tank turns left, their light, they're dead. But tank number 4 saw 3 tanks turn left and get virtually shot and killed. So they realized that was a mistake. So tank number 4 turned right. And then 396 other tanks turned right. They took the high ground and won the exercise, right? So what Mike learned from that was, first of all, Mike made a mistake, right? He turned left, he should have turned right. Mistake. Leadership mistake. But what he learned from it was sometimes it's better to make the wrong decision quickly than make the right decision slowly. Like imagine if he had stopped the tank and waited the 30 seconds, turn the light on, get the map out. There'd have been 400 tanks lined up, stopped, just like sitting ducks getting shot at, right? They probably would have all been shot, right? But by making a quick decision, even if he didn't know if it was the right decision, was better because war, like life and in business, will surface your mistakes to you right pretty quickly. Right. Something bad will happen and you'll realize, oh, that was a mistake. I should have done the other thing, right? So unless it really is life or death, sometimes it's better to not get stuck in 6 months of analysis paralysis and go ahead and try something and see if it works. And if it doesn't, you still got 3 months left before you would have made a decision in the first place because your competitor is not standing still, right? So yeah. That has made him a very decisive leader today. So now he makes decisions very quickly, but he's also very forgiving of other people when they make mistakes as long as they learn from them. So he'll tell you that story when you first meet him, and it sets your expectations of, if I want a leader to make a decision quickly, I want to go to Mike because he'll make it quickly. But also, he's the guy that will be okay if I make a quick decision, but I make a mistake.
Yeah, that's fun. And I can see how that helps align with a lot of what's going on right now in like complexity theory and like how do you, it makes all of those things really real because there's a lot of talk right now about in business, it's our goal or our necessity to make what we call safe to fail probes. And which means, try stuff, make a decision, try stuff, get some feedback from the universe. And I can see how the story that you tell there fits very nicely with another recommended practice, which is decision logging. So, and a decision log is, one of these it's kind of stale. It says this is the decision we made and the rationale and who was involved and when we're going to look at it later. But each and every one of those logs is really a story, right? It's we had a moment, we had to make a decision. This is where we went. This is what we think will happen. And the telling of the stories of how decisions come to be, I think, is a really great example of a leadership style story. And a fabulous way. We know this actually from the research, both in team performance and in meetings, to increase engagement and trust and transparency. People don't have to be involved in all the decisions if they at least understand how they're being made.
Right.
Great. So that was a useful question. Any other questions on where we're at so far? We've got 2 more types to go. Okay. So our next meeting type that we're talking about is the governance cadence meeting. And governance cadence meetings, so they're basically about, overall the goal of these meetings is to provide some external validation that your business or your team or your relationship is on the right track. So this is going to include things like the board meeting where they have, a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that you're doing what you need to do, but also need to come in and help you, work through some problems and make sure your strategy's sound. And similarly, when you work with a client, so you maybe every 3 to 6 months, you'll meet with high dollar clients and you'll say, okay, well, here's what we've done for you for the past year. And here's what we've seen. And here's what's coming up. And how can we work together? And the whole goal there is to convey to these folks that you're connected to, but lightly connected to, some sense of what's going on with your business quickly. Because this is not their world, right? They've got their own worlds. Quickly. And then turn as much value as you can out of that relationship in that, 60, 90, maybe 3-hour time period. So what are some stories we can use to help make our governance cadences meetings more efficient and powerful for getting those results?
Yeah. So you'd mentioned the importance in those meetings of quickly getting your message across, and presumably in a way that would be remembered and acted upon. So yeah, what I want to do is share a story about one of those governance meetings where a CEO did that very, very well. So you can learn from that experience. So this was Scott Ford was the CEO of Alltel, which is a wireless telecom company in Arkansas. And again, it's back in 2007, I believe. And the company had just gotten bought by a venture capital firm, private equity firm. And so the new ownership came in. So they basically took over the board. And in the first board meeting that they immediately called, which they wanted him to present at, they wanted him to teach them basically how to run the whole business. Because basically they were planning on getting rid of him. And, these companies, they come in, they buy the company, they replace the management, they, make some other changes, and then they want to turn around and sell it a few years later at a much higher price. I mean, these are not long-term buy and hold people. So he knew he was going to get fired pretty soon. But, his first meeting with them, they said, we don't just teach us everything you know about running this business.
What, you got an hour? Right.
Exactly. So he did his best to teach them what he could in that hour. But before he was done, he said, look, now let me tell you what you really need to know, because I know how you operate. I know what you want to do is turn this business around and sell it for a much higher price in the next year or two. So he said, there are three things that are going to have to be true for that to happen. And they're going to have to be true all at the same time, right? First of all, the potential buyer is going to have to be one of the big telecom companies like AT&T or Verizon or Sprint, because no other private equity firm is going to value this company as much as you did when you just bought it. So they're not going to be willing to pay more than you just paid. Okay. So you're going to have to sell it to a big telecom company. Second of all, interest rates are going to have to be really low, because the leveraged buyout that the buyer's going to have to borrow billions of dollars to pay for it. And that won't make financial sense if interest rates are really high. So you need a really strong bond market has to be in effect at the time that you want to do this. And then thirdly, he said, the administration, the presidential administration in Washington needs to be kind of in the right mood at the time, because if they think that there's too much anti-competitive activity, big company buys another big company, then the Justice Department can come in and just void the transaction, and you won't even be able to make the sale. And he said, all three of those things need to be true at the same time. And he said, and he used a brilliant analogy, and here's the technique that I wanted you to learn. Is he said, and by the way, this private equity firm was from New York City. All right.
Okay.
And he said, so it's kind of like trying to hail a cab in New York City. It takes a long time for one to show up, right? Because they're so busy. But whenever one does show up, you better get in, because you'd never know when another one's going to show up. So obviously this is 2007, before there were Ubers running all over the place, right? Mm-hmm. It was actually hard to hail a cab back then. You'd be waving your hand around, and you might wait 15 minutes just to get a cab. It was ridiculous. So he had this picture on the screen of a yellow cab and somebody getting into the yellow cab in the streets of New York City. And he said, again, that was the analogy, was all three of these things have to happen. It rarely happens that all three of these things are true. If it happens, it's like getting a cab in New York City. And so you better get in, because you never know, when it's going to happen again. So at the end of the meeting, they fired him. Okay. just like he expected. But then a year later, one of those leaders called him on the phone and said, hey, I just wanted to pick your brain for a minute, because we just got an offer to buy the company for $28.1 billion. And I don't know what to do. I don't know if that's high enough. Should we wait for another offer? So I just wanted to talk through with you the right thing to do. Do you think we should take it? Should we negotiate better? Should we wait for another buyer? And then Scott just sat there on the other end of the phone, did not say a word, literally did not say a word. Like there's just an awkward silence for 7 or 8 seconds, which must have seemed like a minute, right? At the end of that awkward silence, the guy in New York on the phone said, "This is the yellow cab, isn't it, Scott?" And Scott was like, "Yeah." So literally the next day they issued a press release saying that Alltel was purchased for $28.1 billion, right? And all it took was that one really telling metaphor that he used a year earlier, and all of the things that he had taught that guy all came crashing back to him at the right moment when he needed to make a decision. And Scott literally didn't say anything on the whole entire phone call, right? So that's the power of a well-placed metaphor in one of those governance meetings that can stick with the board for a long time.
That's cool. And it's a great illustration of what's going on in storytelling. that we don't have available to us in all of the other ways that we share information, right? So in the if you look at meeting advice, you'll see death by PowerPoint as a really common complaint, and people feel comfortable sharing PowerPoints full of data, right? Here's the information, here's the data. But the problem is our brains don't retain that information later successfully. It's super useful to have the everything written out in the slides so that you can go back and refer to it later if you need to copy and paste the data out and whatnot. But it's not as effective for getting it to stick, right? So from our most foundational sort of evolutionary perspective, like if you look at what people are talking about in terms of how we became cultures, how we became civilizations, the ability to tell a representative story, to illustrate that this thing happened there and it is like this other thing in the metaphor, and then have that stick is what makes it possible for us to organize. So a story like that both conveys, the critical information they needed, and then also the retrieval.
Right. Way to retrieve it.
Here's a way to make that accessible to you. So when you're looking at working in these governance meetings, and frankly, all of them, and you have big information to share the information, absolutely, but then share the story. Because that is the way to help actually engage the brain and make that something that people can use and remember.
Exactly.
Awesome. Any other questions on that one? Because we've got just one more to go. And it's going to be perfect. Okay. So on that front, our last meeting type is the problem-solving meeting. And the problem-solving meeting is one of those places where you and your team, you and whoever's assembled are facing an incredible challenge. Now, structure-wise, problem-solving meetings all should follow a similar structure. And the first step in a problem-solving meeting is for everybody to agree what that problem is, right? And that in and of itself can be one of those places where you've got all that data that you need to deal with. So number one, what is the problem? Step two, okay, what does our solution need to actually achieve? Right? So your problem may be that you're coming shy on payroll, or that your competitor just beat you to market with a key new feature. Your solution doesn't necessarily need to be that you dominate the market. The solution may need to be that you find a way to make it to the next month. So the solution criteria is step two. Step three, what are our options? What might we possibly do to solve this problem? Step four, which one are we going to pick? And then step five, what's our plan? So that's the foundational problem-solving meeting pattern. Paul, what are some stories we can use to help work through that kind of meeting?
Yeah, so storytelling here, I think, helps you with that second step that you mentioned. So not the defining the problem, but the brainstorming potential solutions. And so here's what you want is kind of a classical outside the box thinking problem to spur the creative juices of the team to think in broader ways than they would normally in a meeting like that. And the stories can come from anywhere. It does not even have to be at your company or even in your industry. In fact, sometimes it's better the further away from your business they are, because it really gets you to think bigger. So one of the examples I like to use here is about window unit air conditioners. All right. So there was a company that made these window unit air conditioners, and they wanted to launch a new product, a new window unit air conditioner that was significantly quieter than all the other air conditioners on the market, because those things can get kind of loud. But they wanted to charge more money for the quiet one, and they needed to know how much more money would people pay for the quiet version, so they'd know how much they could invest in building this thing. But therein lies the catch-22. They hadn't built the thing yet, they hadn't invented it yet, but they needed to go do some testing with consumers to find out how much they'd pay for it. But it turns out you can't just call consumers on the phone and say, hey, how much more would you pay for a quiet air conditioner that's maybe 30 decibels quieter than your current one? Like, nobody knows what that means, right? So they were in a quandary. And what many companies would do is say, well, we just need to invent a prototype and go test it with people, which is going to take months and millions of dollars and whatever. So when I was talking to the person who shared this with me, I said, okay, what did you actually do? The research people. And she said, oh, it was really simple. We took one of our regular air conditioners, the noisy kind, and we opened it up and took out all the insides. And then we closed it up, put it back together, and we put it into the window of one of our test homes. And then on the back of it, we cut a 4-inch diameter hole in the back of it. And we ran a flexible tube out the back of it and down the hallway into the next room where we had it plugged in to the front of, another regular air conditioner. And so then we marched consumers by the fake one in this room. And when they turned the knob to turn the air conditioner on, we had somebody in the other room turn on the real air conditioner. And then almost like magic, this crisp, clean air came blowing out of the front of this air conditioner, but without making a sound, right? Because there wasn't anything in it. And they said, based on how far away or down the hallway we moved the real air conditioner, kind of changed how much noise they could hear in the test room. So that was their creative way of testing how much people would pay for a quiet air conditioner versus a noisy one without actually inventing it first, right? And it cost almost nothing to do this instead of the millions you could imagine that they might spend on a prototype. And so I share that story with people to have them think more creatively about their business. How could you do something without actually having to go invent everything from scratch?
That's awesome. So in terms of the takeaway for this particular one, the problem-solving story, there's great evidence if you read Gary Klein's book on seeing what others don't see. So that's a book all about stories of how people had these amazing insights, right? Each and every one of those stories might be a fabulous story to have in your pocket to bring out for moments like this, right? So the kinds of stories we tell don't have to be our own stories. And I think that's absolutely true in our business too, for sure. And clearly that's true for you, because Paul, I didn't hear any stories about your business except for our pre-story. And yet they achieve their goals. So when you work with folks to, so there's a question. They ask, shouldn't we also determine why this is because a problem, so our problem-solving solution will not repeat the same situation? Yeah, absolutely. So I think in this particular example, this is an example of, it's not, I don't believe Paul's implying that we should skip understanding what the problem is, but more that when we get into that stage where we're looking for alternatives, after we've figured out what our problem is and what we need to achieve with our solution, and then we start looking at what are some kinds of possible ways we can solve it? That's when we would use a story like that.
Yeah, I think the question is suggesting that in that phase one that you mentioned, where you're figuring out what the problem is, I think they're suggesting part of that ought to be figure out why the problem occurred in the first place. And I think that's a fair, thing to add to that part of the problem-solving meeting.
Right, absolutely. And frankly, each and every one of those steps can, in fact, be started with a quick story. You could, in fact, tell a story about the problem, which is frankly what most of us do. If you want to inspire a group to truly solve a problem, you don't start with hey, here's the budget sheet, everybody read it, right? You say, okay, we are coming to the end of the month. These are the bills that are due. Here's a story about what might happen in the next month if we don't solve this problem. So we have another question, which is, how do you, couple of questions. So one is, how do you build a story for an intense meeting? Are there any tips that are special for meetings where they're really fraught with tension or conflict?
Yeah, so these are where you probably need a distraction, as a palate, an emotional palate cleanser, because there's a lot of tension in the meeting. So literally, here's where you could tell a story about anything at all other than what's going on. Just a personal story about this weekend or the last movie you saw or something to distract people and clean their minds out just for a minute. And then you can re-engage once, the emotional level has dropped back down to a kind of normal. So this distracting sounds like an odd thing to want to do in a meeting, but I think that's exactly what you'd want to do at this point, is give everybody something else to think about for a few moments and then get back to the topic at hand.
I can see that being important, because a lot of what we're doing in meetings is we're managing collective energy. right? So one of the things that we talk about a lot is having meetings start with some sort of positive moment to begin with. It, could be an icebreaker, could be a moment of silence, could be any number of things. But what you're doing is resetting and framing the energy. Now, I can see how a distracting story can help change.
Maybe funny is the right better term. Tell a funny story. Just lighten the mood a little bit, so that people can reset their kind of emotional bar.
And then after that, I think probably it's important to actually tell a story about the elephant, right? Or the dead moose or whatnot, because there's often an enormous amount of tension that happens because we're not talking about the thing we need to talk about. And if you can tell a story about your relationship, and I think Brene Brown's work is really important here, about your anxiety, your fear, your trepidation, but also your hope around that tension, that can put it out there in a place where everybody can say, okay, finally, this has been named, and you can start to all share stories that allow you to move out of that place of tension. But there's a significant amount of energy management you're doing in those situations, and shifting the energy and then focusing and releasing that energy is a great way to break that tension.
Right.
So final question, and we've got just a couple more minutes till we get to the end. We made it through all 5 types. Yay. Which was, how do you correct course when you are losing your audience? Boy, I hope that's not a statement, but it's followed by, that was great and insightful. So
yeah. So you want me to tackle that one?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So first of all, just recognize it and ask a question. So if I notice I'm losing my audience, I stop immediately where in mid-sentence, whatever I'm saying, and say, it looks like maybe not everybody's tracking with what I'm saying. Where did I lose you? So I ask for, help me get back on the right track. Do I need to repeat something I said? Or are you already totally on board with this and you already know the next 5 things I'm going to say and I'm going too slow? Like, you need to ask them to give you feedback to know how to get them re-engaged. But don't be afraid to admit that I just recognize that you're all not paying attention anymore. Something clearly happened, and I'm not going to force you to continue to listen without me checking with you and seeing how I can fix it.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing I would add to that one, so I recently just did a course for Cross Knowledge, which is a brand of Wiley, and the way their online courses work is it's 3-minute videos, right? So you have an intro, and then you tell a story, and then you do a closer. And the topic was like how to run all of the meetings in your organization. And I got it 3 minutes at a time. Insane, right? Like how do you do that? And the answer is practice. The more you get into telling stories and the more often you intentionally grab them, write them down, rewrite them, you can get them down to being 2 to 3 minutes long, which means you have very few opportunities to lose your audience. So let's see. Rita, who is a conflict resolution expert, says that if your meeting is designed to address the conflict, a distraction funny story may be perceived by some as not taking their concerns seriously. So, like all of stories, she's got a great point. It completely depends on the timing, for sure. And applying it well. And speaking of timing, we are at the end of our time. So I see that I've missed maybe a couple of other story questions in here. We will follow up with you folks afterwards. And Paul, are you okay if from this one, because we talked and we didn't share a lot of text, go ahead and take the takeaways from this and put it out as a blog post, and maybe you can share some links to the books or the stories on your material that best illustrate some of what we've talked about?
Sure, I'll be happy to.
Great. So we will definitely share that. And then if you are interested in connecting with Paul again more later, his information is here. Again, author of several books. He loves to speak. You can catch him on his upcoming book tour if you're in the South, which is very exciting. And if you want to connect with those of us at Lucid Meetings, we would love to work with you to help make the story of your meetings one that you are proud to tell. You will have an opportunity to give us feedback as soon as the webinar ends. You'll see the recording and our follow-up soon. Thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to be with us. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.